The council hall was one of the largest chambers ever built in the galaxy. Walls curved high above the ground, glowing softly with shifting colors. Delegates from more than 100 species sat in their floating seats, arranged in wide circles. The center of the chamber was open space, reserved for whoever wished to speak. Usually it felt grand and important. Today it felt cold. Human representatives stood in that center space, calm but clearly tired. They had spent weeks trying to explain the same concerns over and over. Their colonies had been ignored, their warnings pushed aside, their complaints marked as low priority. Human speakers had remained patient at first. They had followed every rule, waited through long pauses, and listened politely, even when several delegates made rude comments about their inexperience or short history. But patience had limits. Everyone in the chamber could feel that the humans had reached theirs. One of the human diplomats raised a hand, asking for attention. His voice stayed steady when he spoke, but there was a firm weight behind his words. He explained once again how their distant colonies had suffered repeated resource thefts, border violations, and interference from rogue groups. He explained how humans had filed reports for months without receiving action. He explained how their people were losing trust in the council's process. Not everyone in the chamber listened. A few alien delegates whispered to each other, amused. Others showed bored expressions. Some didn't even try to hide the fact that they weren't taking the concern seriously. One delegate, from a species known for its arrogance, leaned forward and asked in a mocking tone why humans were making such noise over small matters. That was when the room grew strangely quiet. The humans did not shout back. They did not argue. They simply looked at the delegate, then at one another, and then at the entire chamber. The lead diplomat closed his folder, a slow and deliberate motion that made several people shift nervously in their seats. He thanked the council for their time, but his tone made it clear that the words meant very little now. Another human stepped forward and spoke softly. He said that they had tried every method possible to solve the problems through peaceful negotiation, but it was clear the council did not see them as equals. He explained that if the council would not take their concerns seriously, then there was nothing more to discuss. The council hall was still bright and colorful, but suddenly it felt like a storm had rolled in. Whispers rose across the chamber. Delegates leaned toward each other, confused. Was humanity really going to walk away? Were they truly ending talks that had taken years to organize? A few council members laughed at the idea. They believed humans were bluffing. They assumed Earth needed the council, too much to risk leaving, but they didn't understand humans at all. The lead diplomat gave a respectful bow. The other human representatives followed. Then, without waiting for permission or response, they turned and walked out of the council hall. Their footsteps echoed across the wide floor. Many delegates watched in silence, shocked by the calm seriousness of their departure. Some tried to call after them, but the humans didn't look back. The giant doors closed behind them, sealing the sound of the hall away. For the first time in the council's history, a member species had walked out of negotiations with no promise to return. The silence that followed inside the chamber was heavy. Delegates blinked at each other, unsure what had just happened. A few laughed again, insisting humans were simply being dramatic. They said humans would come back. They said Earth had nowhere else to go, but some didn't laugh. Some watched the closed doors, remembering human history. Humans rarely made threats. Humans rarely walked away from a problem. Humans always stayed, always tried, always pushed for cooperation. And because humans were generally peaceful and patient, many species had mistaken that patience for weakness. Now, seeing the humans walk away so calmly, those same species felt a chill beneath their skin. In the walkway outside the hall, the human delegation moved through the long corridors without speaking much. They didn't need to. They all knew what the others were thinking. They had prepared for this moment long, before stepping into the chamber that morning. They had warned their governments that the council might not listen. They had quietly sent reports back home. They had made sure that Earth understood the stakes. When they stepped onto the transport platform that led to their embassy, the lead diplomat finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, and filled with a sense of purpose. He told the others that the decision they had just made would change their relationship with the entire galaxy. He reminded them that humans had always believed in cooperation, but cooperation only worked when all sides were respected. Another diplomat, younger than the rest, asked if the council might come after them for this. The lead representative shook his head. The council was powerful, but they were not foolish. They relied heavily on the systems humans helped maintain. Trade routes, communication relays, security patrols, scientific partnerships humans were deeply woven into the galaxy's functioning. The council didn't fully understand how much they depended on those contributions. Not yet, but they would dot as the transport moved smoothly through the air. Showing a wide view of the city below, the humans kept quiet. It wasn't anger they felt. It was disappointment. They had joined the council, believing the galaxy was ready for unity, fairness, and progress. Instead, they had found arrogance, indifference, and closed minds. They had offered their best and been treated as a minor voice among louder, older species. When they reached the human embassy, staff members greeted them with questions. The diplomats explained the situation calmly. They said the talks had been unproductive and that the council had refused to take human concerns seriously. They said they were returning home with full reports and recommendations for the next steps. Inside the embassy, officers began preparing messages to send to Earth and its colonies. In one room, two diplomats stood by a large window overlooking the cityscape. Flying transports moved through the air, and bright towers rose in the distance. They had once seen this world as a symbol of unity. Now it felt like a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. One of them asked quietly if walking away had been the right choice. The other took a moment before answering. He said humanity had tried everything. They had followed the rules, respected the process, and listened even when treated poorly. But there comes a point when staying in the room becomes more harmful than helpful. He said that walking away wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign of self-respect. Meanwhile, back in the council hall, confusion slowly turned into debate. Delegates argued. Some said the humans were overreacting. Others said the council had failed to address real problems. A few were bold enough to admit that the mocking comments earlier had pushed the humans too far. The council leader called for order, but it did little to calm the rising tension. Quietly, without making a scene, some species began asking themselves a worrying question. If humans had been ignored this badly, how many other species had faced similar treatment? How many members had been too afraid to speak up? How many felt that the council had forgotten why it existed in the first place? The walkout had cracked something open. A truth the galaxy had been avoiding for a long time. The humans didn't know all of this yet. They were focused on contacting their leaders, preparing official statements, and setting the next steps for their people. Yet deep down, they sensed that something bigger had begun. They sensed change, and for the first time in a long time, they felt a strange mix of sadness and strength. They had left the council behind, but they had not lost themselves. They were still human, still determined, still willing to stand up when needed. The galaxy didn't understand it yet, but they soon would. After humans left the council hall, a quiet tension spread across the galaxy that no one expected. For the first few days, many species assumed that Earth's representatives would return. After all, humans had always valued peace and cooperation. They had followed the rules, waded through endless delays, and accepted unfair treatment without complaint. No one imagined that humans could simply step away. Inside the council chambers, whispers turned to arguments. Some delegates insisted that humanity was bluffing. They said humans would realize the council held the power and come back with apologies, begging to resume negotiations. Other species were less certain. They had seen how the humans carried themselves, calm, confident, and steady. The way they walked out had not been anger, not drama, but quiet determination. It was a reminder that humans had patience. Yes, but patience was not endless. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the human leaders met in secure chambers. They were not celebrating, nor were they worried. Their task now was to act responsibly for all of humanity. They reviewed every trade agreement, every colony report, and every communication channel. They were thinking not of revenge, not of power, but of survival, security, and dignity. Humans had always tried to cooperate with the galaxy, but the Council's repeated neglect of their concerns forced them to reconsider what cooperation truly meant. Humans began reorganizing quietly. Ships were redirected to protect vulnerable colonies. Supply chains were strengthened to ensure resources could move without relying on Council-managed routes. Scientists and engineers focused on making colonies more self-sufficient. They were preparing for a future where Earth could act independently, not because they wanted to fight, but because they needed to ensure safety for their people. As days turned into weeks, other species began to notice the change. At first, they dismissed it. "Humans will return," said one alien ambassador, a being with long silvery tendrils and sharp, calculating eyes. "They always do." Another species, a reptilian race known for their pride, snorted at the idea, confident that humans were still dependent on the Council for trade and technology. But then reports began arriving. Human colonies that had once relied heavily on Council support were thriving independently. Supply ships moved between worlds without delays. Security patrols kept trade routes safe. And colonies previously considered weak now operated with efficiency and strength. For some, it was puzzling. For others, it was disturbing. It forced them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about humans. Humans didn't announce their successes loudly. They didn't broadcast messages claiming superiority or demand recognition. They simply acted. Every improvement, every efficient patrol, every smooth delivery of supplies quietly demonstrated that humans could operate without the Council. And every time someone tried to underestimate them, the humans quietly proved that they were wrong. Some of the Council's junior delegates began to realize the implications. Humans weren't just surviving outside the Council's oversight. They were thriving. Colonies once deemed fragile were strong and organized. Communities that had been dependent on the Council were now self-reliant. Human ingenuity, teamwork, and resourcefulness were quietly reshaping the galaxy's perception of what Earth could accomplish. The Council itself began to feel pressure, though no member admitted it publicly. Internally, discussions became more urgent, more tense. Analysts compiled reports showing that humans were no longer the same species that had first asked for mediation. They were now a coordinated force, capable of operating independently, and no one had fully understood just how powerful their networks had become. Meanwhile, humans kept preparing. Engineers worked on expanding communication networks so colonies could coordinate without any interference. Scientists developed new technologies, some to improve life on remote planets, others to strengthen defensive systems in case the Council tried to pressure them. Every action was deliberate, calculated, and patient. Humans didn't need to show off. They knew the results would speak for themselves. Trade in regions once controlled by the Council began to subtly shift. Humans began organizing their own convoys and supply chains, offering fair deals to species willing to cooperate directly with them. This was not a threat, just a logical step. Humans wanted stability and mutual benefit, not conflict. But the shift was noticeable. Species who had previously relied on Council-approved systems realized they could work with humans independently. The galaxy slowly began to see humans as a force to be reckoned with, not aggressive, but capable, determined, and reliable. Some species tried to send emissaries to Earth, hoping to persuade humans to return to the Council. These emissaries offered promises, warnings, and pleas. Humans listened politely, evaluated each offer carefully, and responded with clear, firm boundaries. They explained that they would cooperate with anyone willing to respect their interests, but they would not bow to anyone who dismissed or ignored them. The message was consistent, and it was simple. Humans were not threatening, but they were no longer dependent. As news of human independence spread, a few species began to worry. Council leaders had always assumed they controlled the galaxy's balance, that humans were just one of many species who needed guidance. But it was becoming clear that humans had never needed the Council as much as the Council thought. They had their own resources, their own strategies, and their own alliances. They could act decisively and efficiently, and that frightened some of the older, more complacent species. At the same time, humans continued to maintain their calm, natural approach. They didn't seek to humiliate the Council or prove superiority. They simply focused on their colonies, their people, and their responsibilities. They showed that strength didn't have to come from aggression. It could come from patience, planning, and persistence. Every new colony that successfully managed its own challenges became a quiet testament to human capability. In the galaxy's smaller systems, word began to spread about the human model. Independent colonies flourished, trade became more reliable, and local species discovered that humans treated them fairly. Even species who had previously doubted humans began to respect their methods. Humans didn't rely on intimidation or force. They relied on clear organization, communication, and cooperation, and that made them stronger in ways the Council had never anticipated. Within the Council, tension grew as reports poured in. Analysts could no longer ignore the fact that humans were changing the balance of influence. Entire sectors previously dominated by Council oversight were now operating under human guidance, and the Council had no real way to stop it. Some members argued that humanity should be confronted, while others quietly admitted they had underestimated the species for far too long. Back on Earth, human leaders continued their work without seeking recognition or praise. They held meetings to plan further support for colonies, prepared new technological projects, and coordinated the construction of new ships for exploration and trade. Every step was measured, deliberate, and focused on long-term stability. The people of Earth watched their leaders with quiet trust, knowing that every decision was for the well-being of humanity and its allies. As months passed, it became clear to the galaxy that humans were not just a species that could survive independently. They were becoming a model for efficient cooperation and development. Other species began to take note, some with admiration, others with unease. Humans were quietly shifting the balance of power, not through force, but through competence, fairness, and careful planning. For humans, this was never about power. It was about survival, respect, and fairness. Every decision, every new plan, every quietly organized supply run reinforced a simple truth. Humans could thrive without the Council, and they would not compromise their values to satisfy arrogance or neglect. And as the galaxy slowly realized the impact of human independence, the Council began to worry. They had always assumed humans would need them. They had always believed that control, influence, and authority over Earth was guaranteed. But those assumptions were wrong. Humans had quietly, steadily, and efficiently proven that they could operate outside the Council's control, and in doing so, they forced the galaxy to rethink everything it knew about the species from Earth. In the end, the human withdrawal from the Council had done more than anyone imagined. It had not caused chaos or destruction. It had not started wars or conflicts. Instead, it had shown the galaxy that humans were patient, persistent, and capable of achieving their goals without begging for permission. And that quiet strength, growing steadily day by day, would soon leave a mark on the galaxy that no one could ignore. Humans had not returned to the Council, and they were not planning to. They had not sought revenge or recognition. They simply acted responsibly, protected their colonies, and showed the galaxy that respect must be earned. And somewhere, deep in the corridors of the Council, the first seeds of doubt had begun to grow. The galaxy had assumed humans would return because they believed they held the advantage. They were learning, slowly and reluctantly, that they had underestimated a species that had never been weak, only patient. As humans continued their careful planning, a quiet shift was happening across the galaxy. While the Council believed that Earth's departure from the peace talks would weaken the species, the opposite was occurring. Humans were not retreating. They were reorganizing, strengthening their colonies, and quietly expanding their influence without seeking attention or recognition. Back on Earth, leaders held daily briefings. Scientists, engineers, and strategists gathered in secure rooms, discussing supply routes, colony needs, and communication networks. Every detail mattered, no matter how small. A single error in logistics could affect thousands of lives. Humans had learned long ago that preparation and attention to detail were the keys to survival. And now these skills were being applied on a galactic scale. Colonies that had once struggled under the Council's bureaucracy began to flourish. Humans implemented self-sufficient systems for agriculture, energy, and water. They trained local teams to manage security and trade independently. These changes were gradual, but consistent. There were no dramatic announcements, no grand speeches, just steady progress. And with each success, human confidence grew. They had walked away from the Council because they valued their independence. And now they were proving that independence was not only possible, but necessary. In nearby star systems, other species began to notice. Traders who had relied on Council-approved routes started receiving messages from human colonies offering more efficient and fairer alternatives. For the first time, these traders realized they did not need to depend on the Council to continue their work. They could cooperate directly with humans, who were both competent and reliable. This simple realization sent ripples through the galaxy. Not all reactions were positive. Some species began to feel threatened by humans' quiet efficiency. The Council, once confident in its control, now faced a growing realization that humans had shifted the balance. Analysts in Council chambers compiled reports showing that Earth's colonies were thriving, that human convoys were maintaining trade routes without oversight, and that humans were gaining influence through competence rather than force. The Council had assumed that authority and tradition guaranteed obedience. They had been wrong. Meanwhile, humans did not boast. They did not claim superiority or demand recognition. Their actions spoke louder than words. Each well-managed colony, each secure supply line, each trade agreement carefully negotiated and fairly executed, demonstrated that humans were capable of more than the Council had ever imagined. Slowly, other species began to respect Earth not because of fear, but because humans had earned it through action. Within the Council, concern began to grow. Junior delegates whispered to each other in anxious tones. "Have we misjudged them?" One asked. "Can they really operate without us?" A more experienced member frowned. "They must return," he said. "We cannot allow them to grow too independent." But even he felt a nagging doubt. Every new report about human colonies operating efficiently without the Council was difficult to ignore. Humans had walked away not out of anger, but out of principle, and their principle was backed by action. On Earth, human leaders began preparing for larger projects. They developed new ships designed for both exploration and trade, ensuring that colonies could receive supplies and communicate with each other over long distances. Engineers designed advanced energy systems that reduced reliance on distant support. Scientists created new technologies that improved daily life on remote planets. All of these efforts were carefully coordinated with long-term planning in mind. Humans were not reacting, they were shaping their future. Even more impressive was how humans maintained calm and civility in the process. Colonists who had once depended heavily on the Council now managed resources and systems with confidence. Conflicts were resolved peacefully, trade disputes settled fairly, and communities thrived because humans had taught the value of cooperation and fairness. The galaxy began to see that humans were not aggressive, but capable. They were not seeking war, but independence. Other species began to approach human colonies with cautious curiosity. Traders, scientists, and explorers visited Earth's networks to learn how humans managed their systems. Many were surprised by the efficiency, fairness, and careful planning they observed. Humans did not exploit these visits for propaganda. They shared knowledge openly, expecting only honesty and integrity in return. This approach earned respect, quietly but deeply. The Council, however, struggled to adjust. They had expected humans to return, perhaps with complaints or even excuses, but not to act independently with such skill and order. Every report from the field contradicted their assumptions. Colonies previously considered fragile were now stable. Trade networks once dependent on the Council now operated efficiently under human coordination. Communications and security were seamless. Every action seemed to demonstrate that humans had not only survived, but grown stronger. Some Council members began to panic. They debated whether to confront Earth directly, fearing that humans might become too influential to control. Others admitted privately that they had underestimated humans for decades. They had assumed that because humans were patient, compliant, and cooperative, they could be dismissed when convenient. But patience should not be confused with weakness, and cooperation should not be mistaken for submission. Meanwhile, humans continued their work quietly. They did not broadcast their successes or seek validation from the galaxy. They focused on tangible results: secure colonies, reliable trade routes, well-trained teams managing local systems. Each achievement reinforced the fact that humans were capable of independence. Other species began to notice this pattern, and some quietly began to reconsider their assumptions about Earth. Traders and diplomats who interacted with humans began to see a new reality. Cooperation with humans was reliable and fair, often more so than with the Council. Colonies that once struggled under bureaucracy now thrived under efficient human systems. Communities felt safe and supported. Humans had not only solved the immediate problems caused by the Council's neglect, but they had also created a model that others could follow. In the Council chambers, fear slowly spread. Analysts warned that humans' influence was growing quietly but steadily. One report noted that colonies that had once been dependent were now fully self-sufficient and capable of independent trade. Another report described the efficiency of human-organized supply routes that no longer relied on Council-managed systems. Every new piece of evidence challenged the Council's authority. Humans, however, remained focused on practical matters. They continued to strengthen colonies, support communities, and ensure that every system under their care functioned smoothly. They were not motivated by pride or revenge. They were motivated by responsibility. Every action reinforced the principle that humans would not compromise their independence, and they would not allow others to dismiss their needs or concerns. Across the galaxy, smaller species began to notice humans' approach. Where other civilizations relied on intimidation or strict hierarchies, humans relied on collaboration, fairness, and efficiency. This difference was striking. Many species began to approach human colonies not with fear, but with interest. They wanted to learn, to cooperate, and to benefit from the human model. The quiet strength and competence of humans were reshaping the galaxy in subtle but profound ways. The Council attempted to respond. They sent envoys to Earth, offering assistance, trade agreements, and proposals to return to negotiations. Humans listened carefully. They responded politely, but firmly. They explained that they valued cooperation, but they would not compromise their independence or dignity. Humans would work with any species willing to respect these boundaries, but they would not bow to arrogance or neglect. The galaxy began to understand that humans had not acted impulsively when they left the Council. They had acted deliberately, with patience, planning, and strategy. Every step was designed to protect their people, strengthen their colonies, and maintain independence. Humans were demonstrating that strength did not come from aggression or control, but from competence, fairness, and determination. In the months that followed, humans continued to thrive. Colonies became models of efficiency, trade networks expanded, and communities felt safe and supported. Other species began to adjust their expectations, recognizing that humans were no longer simply participants in galactic politics. They were capable leaders in their own right. The Council, meanwhile, struggled to regain control. They had assumed humans would return to negotiations out of necessity. They had assumed patience and cooperation could be taken for granted. But humans had demonstrated that independence, competence, and fairness were values that could not be ignored. The Council's assumptions had been wrong, and they were only beginning to realize the consequences. Humans, however, continued their quiet progress. They did not seek recognition, nor did they attempt to humiliate the Council. They simply acted responsibly, carefully, and effectively. Each successful colony, each smoothly managed trade route, and each peaceful resolution reinforced the principle that humans could thrive independently. Across the galaxy, a new understanding began to take shape. Humans were not aggressive, not reckless, but patient, capable, and reliable. Their withdrawal from the Council was N. As human colonies continued to flourish independently, the effects of their withdrawal from the Council became more visible across the galaxy. At first, the changes were subtle. Trade routes that had once depended on Council coordination were slightly delayed. Some minor disputes arose, and a few frontier systems began operating with less oversight. Many species thought these were temporary problems, a minor inconvenience that humans would soon solve, or that the Council could manage. But the impact was deeper than anyone expected. Human colonies were not simply surviving. They were thriving. Every system that had relied on the Council began to notice that humans were managing themselves efficiently. Supplies arrived on time, local security forces operated effectively, and trade continued without the bureaucracy that had previously slowed everything down. Colonies once considered fragile began to demonstrate resilience, innovation, and leadership. The galaxy was starting to see humans in a new light. Back on Earth, leaders remained calm and focused. They had anticipated this moment. They knew that withdrawing from the Council would send ripples across the galaxy, and they had prepared for it. Engineers worked on improving transport systems and communication networks. Strategists mapped out every supply chain and contingency plan. Scientists focused on making colonies more self-sufficient and adaptive. Every decision was made with careful thought, because humans understood that one mistake could have consequences far beyond any single planet. Meanwhile, the Council began to feel the consequences of their own mistakes. The systems that had been dependent on Council oversight now operated under human management, and the contrast was stark. Where the Council had been slow, bureaucratic, and often indecisive, humans were efficient, organized, and fair. Colony leaders began sending reports back to their home systems, praising the effectiveness of human management. Traders began asking for partnerships directly with humans, bypassing the Council entirely. Inside the Council chambers, tension began to rise. Delegates whispered nervously to one another, wondering how humans had managed to gain so much influence without confrontation. Some argued that the Council needed to respond forcefully to remind Earth of its place. Others were beginning to question whether humans had ever been dependent at all. Every report from the field contradicted the long-held belief that the Council controlled the galaxy's balance. As weeks passed, the Council's fear grew. They had assumed that humans would eventually return, that patience would give way to necessity, and that dependence would force compliance. Instead, humans demonstrated independence, capability, and responsibility. Colonies were self-sufficient. Trade routes were secure. Conflicts were resolved efficiently. The galaxy was beginning to see that humans could manage without the Council, and that realization unsettled everyone who had assumed control was theirs by default. Humans, however, did not act arrogantly. They did not declare dominance or insult the Council. Their approach was deliberate and restrained. Every decision, every improvement, every successful operation was quiet proof of competence. Humans understood that true strength did not come from aggression or loud announcements. It came from responsibility, fairness, and the ability to solve problems when others could not. Smaller species began noticing the differences as well. Where other civilizations relied heavily on hierarchy, intimidation, or influence from the Council, humans relied on clear communication, fairness, and cooperation. Their systems were transparent, their management effective, and their approach dependable. Many species began to respect humans quietly. Some even began seeking guidance or partnerships. Humans offered help without controlling, guidance without forcing, and support without strings attached. The contrast with the Council's bureaucratic methods was clear and striking. The Council tried to respond. They sent envoys, messages, and proposals, hoping to lure humans back into negotiations. These messages were polite but urgent, offering rewards, positions, and assurances. Humans read every proposal carefully. They responded with courtesy but set clear boundaries. They were willing to cooperate with anyone who respected their independence. But they would not compromise their principles for the sake of returning to a Council that had ignored their concerns. Back on Earth, humans continued preparing quietly. They expanded infrastructure, built new communication systems, and trained new teams for trade, security, and resource management. Every new project was designed with long-term stability in mind. Humans had learned that independence was not simply about leaving the Council. It was about ensuring that their colonies could thrive without relying on external support. As the galaxy began to feel the consequences of human independence, some species began to panic. They had long relied on the Council to manage trade, security, and diplomacy. Now they faced a reality in which humans were capable of handling these responsibilities themselves. Entire regions of the galaxy began operating more smoothly under human guidance than under Council oversight, and the Council had no way to undo it. Trade routes shifted quietly but noticeably. Traders who once depended on Council protection now preferred human-managed routes. Supply chains became more reliable, and communication was faster and more efficient. Colonies that had previously struggled with resource shortages now had access to steady supplies, and they were better equipped to handle emergencies. The galaxy began to see that humans were not only capable of independence, they were better at managing systems than the Council itself. Within the Council, frustration grew. Delegates debated openly, some arguing that the Council had made a mistake in underestimating humans, while others insisted that humans would eventually falter without the Council's guidance. But as reports kept coming in, it became impossible to deny the reality. Humans had created a model of independence that worked. It was efficient, fair, and sustainable, and it threatened the long-held assumptions of the Council. Humans, meanwhile, remained focused on results. They did not engage in political games or power struggles. Their goal was simple: ensure the safety, stability, and prosperity of their people and colonies. Every action was deliberate, every decision calculated, and every project carefully planned. They acted not out of pride or desire for recognition, but out of responsibility for their communities. Colonies that had once been weak or struggling began to thrive. Leadership was trained locally, resources were managed efficiently, and systems for trade, security, and communication operated smoothly. Humans had turned dependence into independence, and independence into capability. Communities were stronger than ever, and the galaxy began to notice. Some species tried to imitate humans' methods. They observed how humans managed supply chains, resolved conflicts, and coordinated communication. Yet few could replicate the combination of fairness, efficiency, and patience that humans applied. Humans did not force obedience. They earned respect through consistent results. They did not rely on threats. They relied on preparation, foresight, and responsibility. The Council realized, too late, that underestimating humans had been a serious error. They had assumed patience was weakness, that cooperation meant submission, and that independence was impossible without oversight. Humans had proved all of these assumptions wrong. Every colony, every trade route, every successful system challenged the Council's long-held beliefs. Even species that had previously doubted humans began to take note. Traders, explorers, and minor colonies began seeking partnerships with humans, recognizing that they were reliable, fair, and capable. The galaxy was slowly adjusting to a new reality. Humans could operate without the Council, and they could do it better than many had expected. Back on Earth, humans continued quietly. They did not celebrate. They did not seek attention. They simply prepared for the future. They knew that independence required more than leaving the Council. It required constant effort, planning, and responsibility. They focused on the well-being of their people and the stability of their colonies. Their patience, preparation, and capability were now reshaping the galaxy without a single aggressive move. The Council could no longer ignore the changes. Reports flooded in, showing that human-managed systems were more effective than Council-managed systems in multiple sectors. Trade was smoother, security was stronger, and colonies were more resilient. The Council had assumed that humans were dependent and compliant. Now they faced the reality that humans had never been dependent at all. Humans had not returned to the Council, and they had no plans to do so. They had not acted out of anger or pride. They acted out of principle, responsibility, and careful planning. Their withdrawal had not caused chaos or conflict. Instead, it had revealed a quiet, steady strength that reshaped perceptions across the galaxy. For the first time, the Council began to feel doubt. They had assumed humans could be ignored, underestimated, or controlled. They had assumed that patience and cooperation were signs of weakness. But humans had proven that these qualities, combined with competence, planning, and fairness, created a strength far greater than anyone had expected. And as the galaxy slowly adjusted to this new reality, humans continued their work without fanfare. They focused on their colonies, their people, and their responsibilities. They did not seek recognition or power. They acted responsibly, efficiently, and fairly. As human colonies grew stronger and more independent, the ripple effects across the galaxy became undeniable. The Council, which had long assumed it controlled trade, communication, and security, began to realize that humans had quietly taken over responsibilities without confrontation. This was not through force, not through conflict, but through consistent competence and careful planning. Everywhere the Council looked, human-managed systems functioned more efficiently than their own. Within the Council chambers, discussions became heated. Delegates argued over what to do next. Some believed they could still pressure humans to return, using old alliances and trade regulations. Others admitted, quietly and reluctantly, that humans had become capable of operating entirely on their own. They had assumed that patience and cooperation meant submission, but every day brought reports that challenged that assumption. Humans were proving that independence could coexist with order, fairness, and efficiency. Meanwhile, on Earth, human leaders remained calm. They understood the changes they were causing, but were not concerned with power or recognition. Their focus remained on colonies and communities, ensuring stability, safety, and sustainable growth. Supply routes were strengthened, communication networks expanded, and systems were monitored to prevent any disruption. Every project was a step toward long-term independence, not a show of strength. The Council's anxiety grew when reports arrived, showing that trade networks previously dependent on Council oversight were now operating directly under human management. Traders and merchants were choosing human-coordinated routes over Council-managed ones because they were more reliable, faster, and fairer. Colonies that once struggled under bureaucracy now thrived. Local leadership trained by humans made decisions efficiently and effectively, often resolving disputes before they became serious problems. This quiet but growing influence unsettled many within the Council. They had underestimated humans for years. They assumed that patience was weakness, that compliance was a guarantee, and that independence was impossible without guidance. They had not accounted for human determination, resourcefulness, and organizational skill. Now, reality was proving them wrong. The Council attempted to respond diplomatically. They sent envoys with offers of assistance, promises of new positions, and proposals for renewed cooperation. Humans received each message with politeness, but responded with firm clarity. They would work with anyone willing to respect their independence, but they would not compromise their principles for the sake of appeasing an institution that had repeatedly ignored their concerns. Across the galaxy, species that had once doubted humans began to recognize their capabilities. Traders and minor colonies sought partnerships with humans directly, bypassing the Council altogether. They observed human systems, learning from their methods and adopting similar practices locally. Human competence had become a quiet standard of excellence, respected even by species that had once dismissed them. In Earth's command centers, teams coordinated the growing network of colonies. Engineers refined transport systems, ensuring faster and safer delivery of resources. Scientists worked on innovations to support sustainability, improve communication, and strengthen security. Strategists monitored political developments, analyzing shifts in influence caused by human independence. Every detail was planned, every action deliberate, and every outcome carefully considered. Colonies flourished under this careful guidance. Communities previously struggling to survive now had access to steady supplies, reliable security, and well-trained leadership. Conflicts were resolved fairly and efficiently, trade operated smoothly, and communication networks connected colonies seamlessly. Humans had turned independence into competence, showing the galaxy that organization, patience, and fairness could produce results that authority alone could not achieve. The Council's fear intensified. They realized that their influence was diminishing, and they had no clear way to reverse the trend. Every report from human-managed regions highlighted the Council's shortcomings. Where the Council had been slow and bureaucratic, humans were quick, precise, and effective. Where the Council had relied on hierarchy and intimidation, humans relied on cooperation, fairness, and shared responsibility. This contrast became increasingly impossible to ignore. Humans did not seek to dominate or humiliate. They acted responsibly, fairly, and efficiently, simply ensuring the well-being of their people and colonies. Their success was quiet but undeniable. The galaxy began to notice that humans could manage complex systems independently, and that recognition was earned through results, not authority. Some Council members suggested aggressive action, arguing that humans had grown too independent. They proposed sanctions, restrictions, and even threats. But others pointed out that humans were deeply integrated into galactic systems. They managed trade, security, and communication in ways that supported not only their own colonies, but also the galaxy's stability. Aggressive action could backfire, causing more disruption than anyone anticipated. Meanwhile, humans continued to expand their influence quietly. Colonies in distant regions began thriving under local management. Trade networks became self-sustaining. Resource distribution improved. Communication systems connected isolated communities efficiently. Each success demonstrated that humans were capable of independence, responsibility, and leadership without coercion or confrontation. The galaxy slowly began to understand that humans were not just participants, they were leaders by example. Other species began seeking guidance, advice, and cooperation. They observed that humans solved problems logically, fairly, and efficiently. Unlike the Council, humans did not demand obedience. They earned respect through action. The Council finally realized the magnitude of their miscalculation. They had assumed that humans' patience was weakness, that their cooperation was dependency, and that their independence was impossible. But humans had demonstrated that strength came not from dominance, but from competence, planning, and fairness. Independence, responsibility, and effectiveness had become hallmarks of humanity's growing influence. Even species that had once ignored, humans began to approach them carefully. Traders, scientists, and minor colonies saw humans as reliable partners. They valued fairness, efficiency, and transparency qualities they rarely observed elsewhere. Human colonies had become models of management, cooperation, and self-sufficiency. The influence humans gained quietly now began reshaping the galaxy's understanding of authority and competence. Humans, however, remained focused on practical outcomes. They did not boast or flaunt their success. They concentrated on maintaining stability, ensuring security, and strengthening trade and communication networks. Every decision, every project, and every improvement was made with responsibility and foresight. Their calm, steady approach contrasted sharply with the Council's panic and indecision. As months passed, the galaxy's perspective began to shift. Where species had once assumed the Council controlled everything, they now recognized humans' quiet but growing competence. Human-managed systems were more efficient, fairer, and more reliable than Council-managed ones. Colonies that had once relied on guidance were now self-sufficient. Communities were thriving. Trade networks were secure. Communication was seamless. Humans had achieved what the Council had assumed was impossible. The Council attempted to regain influence, but it was too late. Humans had already established new patterns of cooperation, management, and independence that could not be undone. The galaxy had quietly begun to follow humans' example. The Council's authority, once taken for granted, was now questioned not through confrontation, but through competence. Humans had not returned to the Council. They had not sought recognition or reward. They acted responsibly, fairly, and efficiently, ensuring the safety and prosperity of their colonies. Through these actions, they demonstrated a simple but profound truth. Respect must be earned. Independence can coexist with order, and patience does not equal weakness. The galaxy had assumed humans were dependent. They had assumed patience was weakness. They had assumed cooperation meant submission. But humans had quietly proven all of these assumptions wrong. Through planning, fairness, and determination, humans had shown that they could thrive independently, lead by example, and earn the respect of those around them. And in the Council chambers, the first real signs of regret began to emerge. Delegates admitted quietly to one another that they had underestimated humans. They realized that their failure to take Earth seriously had created a force more competent, more respected, and more capable than they had ever imagined. Humans had not sought power. They had not sought conflict. They had acted responsibly, efficiently, and fairly. And in doing so, they had quietly forced the galaxy and the Council to acknowledge a truth that could not be ignored. Underestimating humans was a mistake. The galaxy was changing. But humans continued their work without pause. Colonies remained secure, trade continued efficiently, and communities thrived. Humans had withdrawn from the Council not to challenge authority, but to protect their people and ensure independence. In doing so, they had proven that true strength comes from competence, responsibility, and fairness, not intimidation or hierarchy. The Council could see the results, but had no power to undo them. Humans H. The months that followed were unlike anything the Council had expected. Humans continued to operate independently, yet quietly, without conflict or aggression. Colonies across distant star systems thrived. Trade routes were managed efficiently, communication networks worked seamlessly, and every community that had once struggled under the Council's oversight was now stable and self-sufficient. This steady growth left the galaxy watching with a mixture of admiration, unease, and curiosity. Within the Council chambers, tension had reached a breaking point. The delegates had long underestimated humans, assuming patience was weakness and cooperation meant dependence. Reports from the field showed the opposite. Humans were organized, fair, capable, and respected by other species. Their influence was spreading quietly but steadily, and it was clear to everyone in the Council that ignoring humanity had been a mistake. After several internal debates, the Council finally decided to act but carefully. They sent a delegation to Earth, not to command, threaten, or punish, but to acknowledge their miscalculation and attempt a cautious reopening of diplomatic dialogue. They wanted to understand how humans had managed to achieve so much independently, and they hoped to repair the fractured relationship before it became irreversible. The human leadership received the delegation without hostility. They were calm, measured, and patient. Every member of the Council delegation was aware that they were entering a territory defined by human competence and dignity. Earth's representatives greeted them politely, offered them a place to sit, and allowed the conversation to begin on neutral, respectful terms. The Council delegates spoke first. They admitted openly that their assumptions about humanity had been wrong. They acknowledged that they had ignored human concerns, dismissed their warnings, and failed to act when they should have. For many, it was difficult to admit these mistakes. Pride and tradition had long guided their actions, and humility was not something they practiced often. Yet the humans were listening, steady and composed. Without anger or ridicule, the human lead representative spoke calmly and clearly. They thanked the Council for acknowledging their errors, but emphasized that respect was earned, not granted automatically. They explained that humans had acted independently not out of defiance, but out of responsibility for their colonies, their people, and their long-term stability. They stressed that cooperation was welcome, but it must be built on fairness, mutual respect, and trust. The Council delegates listened intently. They realized that humans had not only survived without them, they had thrived. Colonies that were once struggling had become models of efficiency, self-sufficiency, and stability. Trade networks functioned without interference, and communities were safe and well managed. Humans had quietly demonstrated a new standard of competence that the Council had failed to anticipate. Across the galaxy, the effects of this meeting were observed closely. Other species noted the calm authority and fairness with which humans conducted themselves. Humans did not demand recognition, nor did they seek to humiliate the Council. They simply spoke the truth, set clear boundaries, and reminded the galaxy that independence could be maintained with responsibility and cooperation. The Council began to understand that their previous approach, assuming authority based on tradition and power, was outdated. Humans had shown that influence could be achieved through competence, fairness, and careful planning. This realization changed not only how the council viewed humans, but how they viewed governance itself. Lessons in patience, respect, and responsibility were quietly being learned. Humans then explained the changes they had implemented across their colonies. They detailed how supply chains were strengthened, how local leadership was trained, and how communication networks connected distant systems efficiently. They emphasized that every decision had been made with sustainability and fairness in mind. The council listened, some with surprise, others with humility, realizing that humans had achieved more in independence than the council had in decades of oversight. This conversation marked a turning point. The council acknowledged that they had underestimated humans, and humanity's approach to leadership and governance became a model for other species to observe. Humans had demonstrated that cooperation did not require submission, and that patience and fairness could accomplish more than authority and intimidation. The galaxy slowly began to adjust to this new reality. Trade began to flow more evenly as species recognized that humans provided reliable and fair systems. Other colonies, inspired by human efficiency, began reorganizing their local governance along similar lines. Human colonies served as examples of self-sufficiency, fairness, and responsibility. The quiet competence of humans reshaped expectations across distant star systems. Despite the Council's formal acknowledgement, humans remained measured in their response. They did not claim superiority, nor did they attempt to control others. They were focused on sustaining their colonies, supporting communities, and ensuring stability across the regions they managed. Every action was deliberate, efficient, and fair. Humans had shown that true strength did not come from domination, threats, or coercion. It came from competence, foresight, and responsibility. Some species began seeking partnerships with humans voluntarily. Traders and explorers observed human systems and requested guidance. Colonies that had previously relied on the Council reached out to human leaders for advice on management, trade, and communication. Humans shared knowledge openly, but always insisted on fairness and mutual respect. This approach further reinforced their reputation as leaders by example, not by authority. The Council, now humbled, started to reevaluate its own methods. They realized that authority alone could not create trust or efficiency. Observing humanity's achievements, they began discussions about reforming their systems, seeking ways to integrate fairness, responsibility, and competence into their governance. Humans had unintentionally provided a model that could reshape even the oldest institutions in the galaxy. Back on Earth, human leaders continued their careful planning. They expanded infrastructure, trained new leaders for emerging colonies, and strengthened communication networks. Their focus remained on preparation and sustainability, not recognition. Every colony operated efficiently and independently, ensuring that humans were no longer vulnerable to neglect, oversight, or delay. Independence had become the new standard, achieved not through confrontation, but through careful, patient work. Across the galaxy, a new understanding emerged. Humans were capable, fair, and competent, and they could maintain independence without conflict. The Council's misjudgment had created an opportunity for humans to quietly demonstrate the value of responsibility, planning, and collaboration. Species that had once doubted Earth began to recognize that independence could coexist with cooperation, and that leadership could come from respect earned, not authority imposed. This quiet shift reshaped the balance of influence across star systems. Humans were no longer seen as minor participants in galactic affairs. They were respected partners and leaders by example. Colonies were models of efficiency and fairness. Trade routes operated reliably, and communication networks connected distant worlds seamlessly. Humans had achieved influence not through dominance, but through action and integrity. The Council had finally learned the lesson. Too late, underestimating humans had been a mistake. Their patience, fairness, and competence were not weaknesses. Their independence was not defiance. Humans had proven that long-term success came from responsibility, planning, and respect. The galaxy was taking note, and the Council was forced to adjust its approach to accommodate a species it could no longer dismiss. Humans remained calm. They did not boast or celebrate. They continued their work quietly, focusing on communities, colonies, and trade. Their actions continued to demonstrate that independence could be maintained responsibly. Respect was earned, fairness mattered, and competence spoke louder than authority. The galaxy began to see humans as leaders not by decree, but by example. Colonies thrived. Communities were secure. Trade was fair and reliable. Other species looked to humans for guidance and partnership. Through careful, patient action, humans had reshaped perceptions of power, influence, and governance. In the end, the Council recognized their mistake fully. They understood that humans could not be ignored, underestimated, or controlled. But they also realized that confrontation was unnecessary. Humans had shown that independence, patience, and fairness were more effective than coercion or authority. By quietly demonstrating competence and responsibility, humans had reshaped the galaxy without conflict. Humans had withdrawn from the Council to protect their dignity and independence. They had acted responsibly, efficiently, and fairly. Through patient, careful action, they had demonstrated a simple truth: respect must be earned. Independence can coexist with cooperation, and patience should never be mistaken for weakness. And as the galaxy adjusted to this new reality, humans continued quietly. Their colonies remained stable, trade continued reliably, and communities thrived. The Council, humbled and cautious, began to approach humanity with respect and recognition. The lesson was clear to everyone. Underestimating humans had been a mistake, and patience, fairness, and competence could achieve more than power all.